Hey, Crush Talkers. Welcome back to Crush Talk, the podcast where your crushes turn into conversations. Today, we're diving into the Los Angeles wildfires. You know, those heartbreaking fires that have been just ripping through the city. And we've gathered like a whole bunch of different sources, transcripts, news articles, study guides, all kinds of things to try to get a deeper understanding how people are reacting to this, like celebrities, the community, just kind of the overall response to this massive disaster.
Yeah, it's really interesting, just looking at these sources. What strikes me is how people are struggling to even put into words just the scale of this thing.
Yeah.
The words they use, unimaginable, insane, devastating. It really speaks to like this shared sense of just not even being able to comprehend the magnitude of what's happening.
It's like their vocabulary is failing them. One quote we pulled out from these sources was just so powerful. It said, "What's happening in Los Angeles right now is unimaginable. So many people's entire livelihoods, their homes, their businesses are gone. That city will never look the same and may very well never be the same."
It really hits home that this is not just a fire.
Yeah.
This is like a complete upheaval of people's lives.
Absolutely. And that feeling of being overwhelmed, of struggling to process it, that comes up again and again in these sources.
And it's not even just about the physical structures, right? We're talking about the loss of memories, the sense of place, a whole community being disrupted.
Yeah. And that personal connection to place is something that Alec Baldwin really emphasizes in his transcript. He's talking about having lived in Los Angeles for 30 years, Venice, Westwood, Santa Monica, the Valley, all these places that hold such personal significance for him. And he's grieving not just for the city as a whole, but for his own memories and experiences that are now like intertwined with this disaster.
Wow.
It's like another layer of loss.
It makes you think about how this resonates on so many levels, individual, communal, even historical. But, one thing that really surprised me as we were going through these sources was the community response.
We hear so much about LA being superficial, but what we're seeing here is anything but.
Right. And the sources highlight this groundswell of support and generosity that completely challenges that stereotype. People are stepping up in incredible ways. They're setting up shelters, organizing donations, even opening up their homes to those who have been displaced.
I love that.
There's this one quote that really stuck with me. It said, "It's so amazing how you see the incredible beauty of people's hearts and like how they just take care of you."
Wow.
It just speaks volumes about the true spirit of this community.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing all this amazing support, but the sources also make it clear that the needs are massive and there's a real sense of urgency. What are people saying is needed right now specifically?
Well, the immediate priorities are housing, clean air power restoration, and ensuring people's safety.
Of course.
The basics. People are calling for financial donations, of course, but also supplies for animal shelters, emergency kits, and this is an interesting one, cash cards for direct aid.
Cash cards. Why are those specifically being mentioned? I mean, isn't cash kind of risky in a disaster situation?
It's a great question, and the sources actually address that, the idea behind cash cards is to give people agency and choice in how they use the support.
Oh, that makes sense.
They receive, when you think about it, everyone's needs are different in this kind of situation.
Right.
Some people might need to replace essential items immediately. Others might need to cover temporary housing costs or transportation. Cash cards empower them to make those decisions based on their own circumstances.
So it's about more than just giving money. It's about giving people the flexibility to meet their own specific needs in a really difficult time. That's a really interesting approach.
It is. And this actually connects to a specific model for disaster relief that's highlighted in the sources. Have you heard of Bethenny Frankel's work in this area?
Wait, Bethenny Frankel, the talk show host? What does she have to do with wildfire relief?
I know, right?
This is where it gets interesting. Crush Talkers, don't go anywhere.
So welcome back to Crush Talk, the podcast where your crushes turn into conversations. We were just talking about cash cards for disaster relief, and it turns out Bethenny Frankel has been doing a lot of work with this kind of direct aid.
Really?
Yeah, she's been involved in disaster relief efforts in places like Ukraine and Hawaii, and the sources we've got really highlight her approach as a model of efficiency.
Wow, I had no idea.
Yeah.
So what is her approach exactly, and how is it different from traditional disaster relief?
Well, she really emphasizes having pre-stocked warehouses, ready to go, streamlining the distribution process and focusing on essential needs rather than relying on just like random donations.
Right.
This way, the aid gets to the people who need it most quickly and effectively.
That makes a lot of sense. In a crisis, you need to be organized and strategic with your resources. So instead of waiting for donations to come in, she's like proactively getting ready for these events.
Exactly. And, this ties into a broader theme that emerges from the sources, which is the importance of learning from past experiences with wildfires. A lot of people whose voices are represented in these sources have faced these devastating events before, and their past experiences are shaping their responses now.
That's so powerful.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how someone's previous experience is influencing their actions this time around?
Yeah, there's one individual who went through the Paradise Fire a few years back, and they talk about how this current disaster is like having their heart being ripped out of their chest because they're not only reliving their own trauma, but also witnessing their friends and community go through the same pain.
That's heartbreaking. It really underscores the lasting impact of these events and the deep empathy that survivors feel for others going through something similar.
Absolutely. And it highlights a crucial point. Empathy needs to be more than just a feeling. It has to translate into action.
Right.
Several sources really emphasize this. They suggest that we have a moral obligation to help to contribute in whatever way we can.
Yeah.
One person put it really well. They said, "We're in the business of preserving life and giving people what they need."
It's not enough to just feel bad. We have to find ways to actually make a difference, to put that empathy into practice. But before we jump into action, it's also important to take a step back and reflect, right?
You're right. While immediate action is essential, the sources also encourage us to reflect on what we're learning from this experience. It's easy to get caught up in assigning blame, speculating about the causes of the fires. But right now, the priority should be on offering support and finding ways to prevent such catastrophic events from happening again.
Okay, so on the one hand, we need to act urgently to help those in need. And on the other hand, we need to take a long view and consider the bigger picture. How do we reconcile those two things?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Finding that balance between responding to the immediate crisis and thinking about long-term solutions. It's about recognizing that disaster response isn't just about reacting after the fact. It's about being proactive, about implementing strategies to mitigate the impact of future events.
I guess it's like you don't want to just put out the fire. You want to prevent the fire from starting in the first place. And speaking of preventing fires, weren't we about to dig into some of the lessons learned from this wildfire and how they relate to effective disaster response? Don't miss it. Crush Talkers, stay tuned.
Welcome back to Crush Talk, the podcast where your crushes turn into conversations. Before we were talking about the need for both immediate action and long-term solutions when we're talking about these wildfires.
Yeah.
And it seems like these fires are really forcing us to think about the bigger picture climate change disaster preparedness, like the whole shebang.
Absolutely. And, one thing that comes up again and again in these sources is this idea of the California wildfires being a wake-up call. They're highlighting the fact that these events are becoming more frequent and more intense, likely fueled by climate change.
Yeah.
And they're really underscoring the urgent need for systemic change.
So it's not just about putting out the fires, it's about addressing the underlying factors that are making them worse, basically.
What are some of the solutions that people are talking about?
Well, the sources talk about the need for more proactive measures like better forest management, building codes that prioritize fire resistance, things like that.
Right.
And also early warning systems to give people more time to prepare.
Makes sense.
They also emphasize the importance of individual actions, though, like creating defensible space around homes and being more mindful of fire risks during dry seasons.
It's interesting because it's not just about the government or, big organizations. It also comes down to personal responsibility and community awareness.
Exactly. Everyone has a role to play, and one of the most important things individuals can do is just educate themselves about the risks and take steps to prepare. Knowledge is power in these situations.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one key takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with?
I think the most important message is this. While these wildfires are an absolute tragedy, they can also be a catalyst for positive change. By learning from what's happened, by understanding the risks and taking action to mitigate them, we can create a more resilient future for ourselves and our communities.
I love that turning this devastation into an opportunity for growth, for innovation, for creating a world that's better prepared for whatever challenges come next.
Right, and recognizing that while we can't control everything, we can control how we respond to these events and what we do to prevent future disasters.
So Crush Talkers, as we wrap up this episode, we want to leave you with this thought. In a world increasingly impacted by wildfires and other natural disasters, what role do you feel compelled to play in building a more resilient future? It's a question worth some serious reflection, whether it's making changes in your own life, supporting organizations dedicated to wildfire prevention and relief, or simply spreading awareness. Every action counts. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive on Crush Talk, the podcast, where your crushes turn into conversations. Until next time.